On the stage, Jimmy Fallon emerged to thunderous applause. Then came the moment the crowd had been waiting for. The band struck a jazzy chord, and Jimmy's voice boomed, "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the legendary comedian, actor, and author, Steve Martin." The applause erupted like a tidal wave, and out stepped Steve Martin, an icon whose intellectual wit and genre-defining career had shaped comedy for decades. At 79, he carried himself with the effortless grace of a man who'd seen it all, his white hair gleaming under the lights, his tailored blazer a nod to his timeless style. His smile was warm, inviting, the kind that had charmed audiences from Saturday Night Live to The Jerk. But his eyes, sharp, observant, held a trace of wariness, as if he sensed the evening might not go as planned. Backstage, his team had been uneasy all day. The pre-interview briefing with Fallon's producers had been oddly tense. "Keep it light," Steve's publicist had insisted. "Focus on the book, his career reflections. No personal digs, no cheap shots." The producers had nodded, but their assurances felt hollow, and now, as Steve settled into the guest chair, the air crackled with unspoken tension. The book, Laughs and Legends, A Comedian's Journey, sat prominently on the desk, its cover a nostalgic collage of Steve's career highlights. It was meant to be the heart of the conversation, a celebration of a life in comedy. But Jimmy, leaning forward with that too bright grin, seemed to have other plans. The interview began innocuously enough. Jimmy lobbed softballs about the book's inspiration, Steve's early days in stand-up, and his transition to film. Steve answered with his signature blend of wit and humility, recounting a story about bombing at a comedy club in the 70s that had the audience roaring. "You learn more from the silences than the laughs," he said, his voice steady, his eyes twinkling with self-deprecation. The crowd ate it up, but Jimmy's laugh was a beat too loud, his head tilted as if sizing up his guest. Then, without warning, the tone shifted. Jimmy leaned back, his fingers drumming on the desk, and his grin took on a sly edge. "So, Steve," he said, his voice dripping with mock curiosity, "you've been paid for jokes your whole career. But who was laughing?" The question landed like a grenade. The audience let out a nervous chuckle, unsure whether to laugh or gasp. In the control booth, a producer hissed into her headset, "What the hell is he doing?" The cameras zoomed in, catching the briefest flicker of surprise on Steve's face before his smile returned, tighter now, like a man bracing for impact. Steve tilted his head, his eyes locking onto Jimmy's. "Well, Jimmy," he said, his voice calm but laced with steel, "I'd say the millions of people who bought tickets, watched my films, and still quote my lines might have chuckled once or twice." The audience erupted in cheers, a wave of support for their beloved icon. But Jimmy didn't back down. He leaned forward, his grin unwavering, and pressed on. Sure, but let's be real. Your humor, it's cerebral. Not exactly TikTok material, right? Did it ever feel like you were preaching to an empty room?" The crowd's laughter faltered, replaced by a murmur of discomfort. Steve's fingers tightened around the armrest, but his expression remained composed, his years of stagecraft holding firm. "Comedy's not about chasing trends," he said evenly. "It's about connecting. If I reached one person in that empty room, that's enough. But I think I reached a few more than that." His tone was measured, but the weight of his words carried a quiet defiance. The audience clapped, sensing the undercurrent of tension but not yet grasping its depth. Backstage, Steve's publicist paced, muttering under her breath. This wasn't the deal. In the control booth, the director barked orders to keep the cameras rolling, sensing a viral moment in the making. Jimmy, undeterred, shifted gears, his voice taking on a faux sympathetic tone. "Let's talk about your career arc, Steve. I mean, you've done it all. Stand-up, movies, Broadway. But here's the big question. Did Hollywood break you, or did it make you a legend?" The audience leaned in, intrigued by the question's ambiguity, but the barb was clear. It wasn't just about Steve's career. It was a challenge to his relevance, his legacy. Steve's smile faded slightly, his eyes narrowing as he studied Jimmy. The studio grew quieter, the air thick with anticipation. Hollywood doesn't break people like me, he said, his voice low but resonant. It's a machine, sure, but I built my own path, wrote my own rules. Legend? That's for others to decide. I just kept showing up. The audience roared in approval, but Jimmy's expression didn't budge. He tapped his pen against the desk, a rhythmic tick that echoed like a countdown. The tension was now palpable, a living thing coiling around the stage. The crew exchanged glances, the audience shifted in their seats, and social media was already lighting up with posts. Did Fallon just diss Steve Martin? In the booth, a producer whispered, "He's going too far." Steve, still poised, leaned back in his chair, his gaze never leaving Jimmy. The older man's calm was a stark contrast to the younger host's restless energy, and for a moment, it seemed like Steve might diffuse the situation with his trademark charm. But Jimmy wasn't done. His next question was poised on his lips, ready to ignite the powder keg. The studio held its breath, the cameras zoomed in, and the world watched as the confrontation teetered on the edge of explosion. "So, Steve," Jimmy said, leaning in with a glint in his eye, "let's get real. Is it true you've been dodging modern comedy because, well, you're just not funny anymore?" The question detonated. The audience gasped, a collective intake of breath that sucked the oxygen from the room. A few nervous laughs scattered through the crowd, but most sat stunned, their loyalty to Steve clashing with the shock of Jimmy's audacity. In the booth, the director hissed, "Cut to commercial," but was overruled by a senior producer, eyes gleaming at the prospect of ratings gold. Steve Martin's face hardened, his jaw tightening, but his eyes burned with a quiet fury. For a moment, he said nothing, letting the weight of Jimmy's words hang in the air. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of the studio lights. Backstage, Steve's publicist froze, her phone already buzzing with alerts from X number sign Fallon versus Martin was trending. The crew exchanged wide-eyed glances, and a cameraman instinctively zoomed in on Steve, sensing history unfolding. Then Steve leaned forward, his voice low but resonant, each word deliberate. "Jimmy, I've been making people laugh since before you were born. I've played to sold-out theaters, written films that defined a generation, and stood on stages you can only dream of. And you think you can sum that up with a cheap shot about my age?" The audience erupted in applause, a wave of support that crashed over the stage. Jimmy's grin faltered, but he tried to recover, chuckling nervously. "Hey, it's just a question, Steve. No need to—" "No need?" Steve cut him off, his voice rising, not in anger but in righteous clarity. He stood, his presence commanding the room, and the cameras followed, framing him like a titan. "Let me tell you something about comedy, Jimmy. It's not about chasing clicks or throwing punches at people who've earned their place. It's about heart, about truth. And what you're doing right now, it's not comedy. It's cowardice." The audience roared, some leaping to their feet, their cheers a rebuke to Jimmy's provocation. Steve turned to the crowd, his gaze sweeping over them, connecting in a way only a master performer could. "This isn't just about me," he said, his voice steady but passionate. "This is about every artist, every person who's told they're past their prime, because they've lived long enough to master their craft. Age isn't a punchline, it's a badge of survival, and I'm damn proud to wear it." The studio shook with applause, a standing ovation that drowned out the band's attempt to cue a break. In the control booth, producers scrambled, torn between awe and panic. X exploded with hashtags. Yerstunt, Team Steve Martin. Yersian, Fallon exposed. Yersian, respect the legend. Jimmy, visibly rattled, tried to salvage the moment. "Come on, Steve, let's keep it light." But Steve raised a hand, silencing him. "You wanted real, Jimmy? Here's real. I came here to talk about a book, about a career I poured my soul into. But you chose to make it a circus. So I'm done." With that, Steve unclipped his microphone, set it on the desk with a deliberate clink, and walked off the stage, his head high, his stride unshaken. The audience's cheers followed him, a crescendo of admiration that echoed through the studio's glass walls. As Steve disappeared behind the curtain, the stage felt emptier, Jimmy's forced chuckle ringing hollow. "Well, folks, that's showbiz," he stammered. But the audience's applause was tepid, their loyalty now firmly with Steve. Backstage, Steve's team enveloped him, their faces a mix of pride and fury. "You nailed it," his publicist whispered, already fielding calls from news outlets. In the booth, the director barked, "Go to commercial now!" as Jimmy sat frozen, his grin replaced by a sheen of sweat. The aftermath was swift and brutal. By morning, X was a battlefield of opinions. Clips of Steve's speech went viral, amassing millions of views with captions like, "Steve Martin just schooled Fallon," and "Legend status confirmed." His book, Laughs and Legends, skyrocketed to the top of bestseller lists, fueled by a groundswell of support. Editorials praised Steve's dignity, framing his walkout as a stand against ageism and a call for respect in entertainment. "Martin reminded us what true class looks like," wrote Variety, while the New York Times ran a piece titled, "The Night Steve Martin Redefined Legacy." For Jimmy Fallon, the fallout was catastrophic. The Tonight Show's ratings plummeted as viewers turned away, disillusioned by his antics. X posts mocked his desperate grab for relevance, and sponsors quietly pressured NBC for damage control. A hastily issued apology on Jimmy's X account. "I have nothing but respect for Steve Martin, just trying to keep it fun," was met with skepticism, buried under a deluge of Amsakar Fallon-exposed memes. Industry insiders whispered that his tenure as host was on shaky ground, with some speculating he'd pushed too far in a bid to compete with edgier late-night rivals. Steve, meanwhile, emerged as a hero. At a book signing days later, fans mobbed him, chanting, "We love you, Steve." He remained gracious, deflecting questions about the incident with a wry smile. "I said what I needed to say," he told a reporter, then added, "Let's talk about the book." But his silence spoke volumes, his dignity a stark contrast to Jimmy's unraveling. The confrontation became a cultural touchstone, sparking debates about ageism, the ethics of talk shows, and the price of legacy. For Steve Martin, it was a triumph, not just of career, but of character. For Jimmy Fallon, it was a lesson learned too late, etched in the unforgiving glare of the spotlight.